talked about the unfortunate constitutional change that took place in Cameroon last year. I guess there's something that happened which a lot of us out here take for granted and do not give it the importance that it has on the rest of the developments in the country. I'd like for you to just elaborate on that a little bit if you can.
The Constitution of 1996 was a compromise document. For those who followed the tripartite talks and the suggestions after the elections of 1992, and the fact that that document, which was finally adopted, was a compromise based on propositions that have been made by both sides or the multiple sides that were involved in those discussions. And the limitation of presidential terms was one of those provisions that was introduced as a stabilizing factor for Cameroon to help strengthen its nascent institutions. Some of us already had issues with that constitution in the sense that there were provisions within that constitution which could have weakened our democratic institutions. For example, the separation of powers. It's extremely weak in our constitution because the 96th Constitution provided for the creation of a Senate which would have equal powers as the House of Representatives, but whose members will be 70% elected by indirect election and the other 30% appointed, handpicked by the executive branch, which weakens very substantially the ability of the legislative branch of government to exercise proper oversight over the executive branch, which is how you build into a constitutional process the checks and balances that can curb abuses of power, that can oversee the management of public finances, and all of the guarantees that we have in a democratic system. But even then, we stayed away from criticizing that document because it was viewed as a compromise document that would help stabilize the nascent democratic institutions of our country. And to now, through a very targeted process, amend a provision in that constitution when many other provisions have not even been implemented was something that took what was left of the substance of that document, almost took it out of the document itself. And I think that our democratization process took a real hit. And it is difficult for me to imagine that we're going to go through this process of non-limitation of presidential terms for a long, long, long time. I think it's going to become very hard for Cameroonians to accept that. Because they also see the benefits that other countries derive from processes that have limitations in presidential terms. We soon will be celebrating 50 years of independence. And it's difficult to imagine that we've had two leaders since 1960. Just two. This issue of checks and balances doesn't only affect the legislative branch of government, it affects the judiciary as well, because of the way in which the judiciary is laid out in our constitution. It even affects the executive branch of government itself, in the sense that we have things that are very incongruent. We have incongruencies within our constitution, even with regards to the executive branch. We have a situation where we talk about decentralization, and we talk about municipalities or local councils, and we elect local councillors, and they are supposed to elect mayors. But then we go into the cities that are run by mayors, and we appoint government delegates. and we give them all of the powers and all of the resources. And sometimes these government delegates are people who contested local elections and lost. How would you imagine that you're not helping polarize the political discourse in Cameroon that I was talking about? I mean, there are a whole host of issues that would need to be cleaned up for us to have the constitutional framework that we could all be proud of and say, yes, this is a framework that can sustain a country as diverse as Cameroon for the duration. And I think, for me, that's work that still has to be done.
When you ended your presentation, you said, do you want to just stand by and watch these things continue to deteriorate, or do we want to organize ourselves? Do we want to seize the moment? And I think there was a reference by someone else that, well, there may not be enough of Cameroonian organizations that are organized. I know you would know this because there is a lot of discussion, obviously, on the cyber world of Cameroonians, taking positions about what's going to happen in 2011. And one of them is an organization in Europe called CODE.
CODE and its activism in Europe, I am familiar with the activities, and this question was also posed to me in Canada. And it made me think about what I said with regards to the youth, and how the way in which we approach problems pertaining to our youth should be with the idea of associating them and empowering them and coming up with long-term sustainable solutions, rather than short-term gratification for immediate effect. CODE, that organization called CODE, is an organization that is formed by the young men and women who were thrown out of the University of Yaoundé. Students, we all know we all were students. We all were heady, and we wrote tracts and we wrote petitions. It's part of student life. But it's a way to deal with young students in the university other than throwing them out of the university and signing a decree saying that they will never have access to the university in Cameroon. All of these young kids, for the most part, fled the country. They were refugees in a number of West African countries. They found themselves in Europe, and they're extremely bitter. And I think that the price that we as a country are paying today far outweighs the pain that we would have suffered in the early 90s if we approached the issue of le Parlement at the university very differently. We're still paying the price today. I hope that it could be a lesson for some of our leaders, and more importantly, a lesson for future leaders. That's why I say that our society, the Cameroonian society, needs some healing, because there's a lot of bitterness, there's a lot of polarization. It may be beneath the surface, but we have to deal with it, and we have to deal with it soon.